All right, we're going to look at Colonial Maryland. And Maryland is first set up as a colony in 1632, and it is supposed to be a haven for Catholics. While it's supposed to be a haven for Catholics, there ends up being quite a few disputes there, and we're going to look at those today. It's originally a grant given to Lord Baltimore by the king. It's a proprietary colony. In other words, Lord Baltimore is basically like the king there in that territory. And he wanted it to really to kind of show, hey, that Protestants and Catholics can live together peacefully, and that it can be done. It's right in the middle of a lot of turmoil between Protestants and Catholics back in England and the rest of Europe, and so this idea that, hey, it can happen. It turns out that it doesn't happen great here in Maryland either, but there, at least for certain periods of time, there is some success. In 1649, they issue the Act of Toleration, which basically says, as long as you're a Trinitarian Christian, which means most Protestants and Catholics, you had your freedom of religion there. And even though it's a haven for Catholics, there's never a majority of Catholics that live there. More Protestants end up coming than Catholics, which, if you think about it, makes sense considering they're predominantly coming from England, which is predominantly Protestant. But this is a place where Catholics that were maybe in hiding or not able to really practice the way they wanted to or believed back in England were able to come to Maryland and practice their religion more freely and out in the open. Eventually, Puritans actually take control, which is something many people aren't aware of, that there were actually Puritans in Maryland as well, not just in New England. And therefore, the Acts of Toleration are no longer enacted, and Catholics, if they're going to continue to practice, they have to practice basically in private. They might have private, these are some large plantations and things. They have their own little not cathedrals, but their own chapels where they can hire and pay for these kind of services, but it's all got to be done very privately on their own homes or on their own plantations. Not only are there disputes between Protestants and Catholics in Maryland, but there's disputes between the people in Maryland and with Native Americans. There's several different wars that are fought, and eventually that territory becomes obviously English territory, but it doesn't happen right away. And there's also conflict with Pennsylvania. You can see on the map there that Pennsylvania claims territory that today is part of Maryland and is part of Virginia, and Maryland claimed territory that ultimately becomes part of Pennsylvania and also Delaware, and so there was just a lot of conflict over some of this different territory. You can see the territory where that red line is. That's the Mason-Dixon line, and that is what becomes the northern border of Maryland. And then, we're going to talk real quickly about the geography and economy of Maryland. And the geography, it's really dominated by the Chesapeake Bay, and in this region, tobacco becomes kind of the major crop. But lots of other crops could be grown there as well. And the early settlers, it was actually a lot of fairly small farms, and they grew a variety of crops, and almost immediately they didn't have problems with starvation or anything like some of the other colonies. They almost instantly were able to grow enough food to not only feed themselves but even to sell back in Europe as well. By the 1630s, we see the economy start to shift to tobacco economy, and they start growing more and more tobacco. And it's still fairly small farms, and so they're growing other things as well to subsist on, but eventually they start to grow so much tobacco that there's not even enough food for everybody, and so there's laws that are passed saying, hey, you have to grow at least 2 acres of corn, because people are starting to starve in some cases because they don't have enough food, and they're just growing tobacco. Tobacco prices go in decline, and you can't sell your tobacco, and all of a sudden, where before you didn't need to grow food because you could buy your food because you could sell all your tobacco, now you're not able to sell the tobacco and you don't have food. And so they started making people grow different types of food, and they're trying to diversify their economy. By the 1670s, we begin to see a shift from the smaller plantations and smaller farms that existed earlier to large plantations with huge land holdings and lots of slaves. And that's kind of be what is typically we think of then when we think of the Maryland and Virginia, the Chesapeake Bay region. There's these large plantations with huge plantations with hundreds of slaves on them. And that is a quick overview of Maryland.